are you?
Someone like you. Someone who'll rattle the cages.
Oh, and they are. They are, in fact, going to be rattling some cages going into the remainder part of 2025 and very likely into 2026 if any of the reveals and the certain uh, little novelties that were showcased at this specific, very exclusive event that was taking place at San Diego during Comic-Con week by Inart. And big shout out to Inart for again inviting me and the girlfriend to attend this event at this center, which was really well done as far as like the decor, as far as the venue having this very sophisticated feel to it. I really liked like the wine barrels and the lighting and everything that was kind of there from an aesthetic point of view. And again, this is my second time visiting because I knew that for the past year, a couple of years or so, Inart has kind of made a name for themselves within the 1/6 scale marketplace to kind of give the competitor, which I think we can all agree on is Hot Toys, a little bit of run for their money. You know, eventually you do need competition within this hobby, within this industry. So I knew I needed to check this thing out, this event, not only from last year's, but this year, because like I said, they're not only continuing their 1/6 scale series, but also taking a huge step in the 1/12 market, something that I kind of know firsthand, delving into the competition in the likes of what I like to call the prosumer market from companies like Mayfix, Ace Age Figure Arts, Fonjoy to a certain extent. And so after seeing some of the things that they're cooking up and coming down the pipeline from last year, I wanted to see what they tackled here. Well, when you walk into the venue, you're kind of greeted by someone who gives you entryway, gives you a ticket for a free drink, which my girlfriend most definitely took advantage of. And upon seeing the bar and seeing, like I said, the aesthetic and seeing how everything looked like from a decor standpoint, I thought was pretty neat. But then walking on over to the tables, I noticed that there was a surprising lack of actual 1/6 scale figures, which I personally wasn't terribly affected by, but I did kind of empathize a little bit with the 1/6 scale community because there really wasn't that much of a 1/6 scale presence at this event. The three primary 1/6 scale figures that were on the table were of Michael Jackson, Negan from The Walking Dead, of two of rights that Inart has most recently announced for, and then the rather major emphasis on Black Myth Wukong, the recent game from the Chinese company. I can't remember the name right now. Game Science, the Game Science game that was making the rounds as far as the reviews outlets last year. It was nominated for Game of the Year. It was getting an awful lot of accolades. So it only made sense that Inart, also being a Chinese company, was going to put a major spotlight on Black Myth Wukong, not only with that 1/6 scale figure of the protagonist, Sun Wukong, I believe is the name, or the Great Sage. I can't remember what the official terminology of the main character. I haven't played the game. I know very little of it, except for, like I mentioned, the accolades. I also know, however, that on the 1/12 scale division, Inart is putting a major, like I said, emphasis, spotlight on Black Myth, with not just that central character, but rather two variants of that character. One that's called like the Great Sage Warrior, whatever it's called, where he's got like a different outfit, he's got a mask, he's got some cool effects and accessories and pieces that you can kind of assemble together, along with his default look. But then on top of that, you also got like some other secondary characters. You got some of the supporting cast as well as some companions. You even got some enemy figures in there, of which one in particular did kind of pique my interest in terms of how he looks, because he just straight up looks badass. He's the one with like the red armor and the spikes coming out of his forearms and the helmet. That guy looked legitimately awesome. Know very little, if not practically nothing about him. I just know that aesthetically he looked pretty badass. So on the 1/12 scale, he looked pretty well done as far as sculpting and paint is concerned. But I was also a little taken aback by the fact that this whole table was taken up by Black Myth Wukong. So a little bit of a specialty bias was created a little bit there, except for one prototype figure. At least it appeared to look like a prototype at my personal far right. When you walk in at my far right, I saw this unpainted. Some people have said that the material is Phison, like a Phison body of a guy kind of looking like this, pretty yoked up. He's swollen, super jacked, but at the same time, he didn't necessarily look like a straight up Black Myth character. Not only was he an unpainted prototype, but some of the sculpt work around not only the muscular physique, but also the head sculpt didn't look like anything that was taken from that game. If anything, if I had to like reach at straws, I would say he looks like a Superman character. So my guess is that maybe this is a proof of concept that Inart is trying to pitch of what they can kind of come down the pipeline to speak, to see if they can kind of gauge any sort of interest in the general public, to see if they wanted to tackle some comic book stuff. Because frankly, I looked at that body and I think to myself, it's so hyper realistic as far as the exaggeration of the physique, but at the same time, the head looks so much like a Superman that the first incarnation of the Man of Steel that I thought of when looking at that 112 figure was a Hush Superman portrayal from Inart. And frankly, I wouldn't necessarily say no to that. And I would then take it a little step further and see the potential of kind of broadening that line and thinking to myself, a Hush Batman, a Hush Catwoman, other portrayals of comic book counterparts of the DC license. I would say that maybe Inart could have something there. And like I kind of foreshadowed a little bit, you had two other 1/6 scale figures that look remarkable as far as sculpting, paint decal. They were mesmerizing. And that was the Michael Jackson and Negan. Personally, between the two, I will kind of, like I said, lean a little bit towards, no pun intended there, lean a little bit towards Negan because he's one of my favorite aspects about The Walking Dead. I love Jeffrey Dean Morgan, and the likeness is 100% there. The detail and the stitching and the tailoring of his jacket with Lucille the Bat there, the base, everything about it looks incredible. And Michael Jackson, though I do like the outfit, and I also do appreciate that they have a secondary variant on the way that I believe is already up for pre-order through different outlets of wherever you get your 1/6 scale figures from, which is going to be the Smooth Criminal variant with like the suit from the music video. I gotta be honest, every time I see that Michael Jackson figure, I think to myself, if they are willing to tap into the well that is musical artists in the 1/6 scale hyper-realistic format, Inart, I'm just letting you know right now, 1/6 scale Freddie Mercury. You will have my money if that happens. Once I was able to acquire some of that footage, I then kind of took a quick round of the venue just to kind of, get my bearings and such. And overall, like I mentioned before, I do like the venue. I will, however, throw some criticism over primarily to the venue holders, not so much Inart, but just to them. I would say that maybe it's because it was San Diego Comic-Con week, and so other priorities were taken precedent, or maybe the attention was spread a little bit too thin. But a little bit of upkeeping could have been handled a little better as far as cleanliness, as far as things being a little things were a little unkempt in certain corners, specifically the catering table with very little. When me and my girlfriend arrived, it was empty, so we were kind of left with this impression like they weren't necessarily checking it routinely. And it wasn't only until a couple of hours later, after I have already finished grabbing as much footage as I could, that they finally filled it back up. But by that point, me and my girlfriend didn't really want to partake because we were kind of reserving space in our stomachs for a proper dinner, because it was literally around 4 or 5 o'clock, almost in the afternoon, evening. So at that point, we were already going to have to head on out for an actual sit down at a restaurant or whatnot. So I did think that, the people who were holding the venue and holding that thing together, I think were a little, like I said, their attention was on the foot traffic that was happening outside, which is a little bit on the frenetic side, because after all, this is on the actual Harbor Boulevard, where across the street is literally the convention center with an awful lot of cosplayers, a lot of foot traffic, which of course can also set up a scenario for something to go down. So you have to remain attentive at all times. However, I will kind of throw that a little bit back on over to Inart, just some constructive criticism. I did notice that there were a couple of empty cases. I don't know if more stuff was supposed to be set up on the floor, and it kind of left a few lackluster impressions, because I was thinking that maybe we stuck around, there was going to be a new thing set up for display, but in the end, it just ended up being an empty case, and that space could have been reserved for either another playable Dark Knight Rises Batman 112 scale figure that were kind of set up throughout the venue for people to kind of like mess around with, or it could have just been an empty table for people to eat their snacks on, because I noticed that there were some dudes that were kind of congregating around the empty case and didn't have enough space to kind of move their snacks about, resulting in some people like dropping certain little cheese cubes on the floor and whatnot. And speaking of those demo figures that were set up at certain tables, maybe have an Inart representative kind of go around making sure that they're kept up, maybe even sanitized, because we're still dealing with a couple of kids, literal kids here and there, just kind of grabbing them and handling them and kind of rubbing them all over the place. And you know how germ attractive kids are, and especially on a very high foot traffic event or time period like San Diego Comic Con. So I would say that maybe having someone monitoring these things for either that or for a adult that acts like a child who then decides to take some of these Batman figures and put them in very deprecating poses. But enough about that. Let's talk about why it is that you clicked on this video. The big closed curtain reveals, of which we had this line forming to then go inside and get a much more one-on-one interaction, well, somewhat interaction, because we really couldn't really mess around with these things. I don't know if we were kind of allowed, but at the same time, I definitely wanted to get some up close and personal 4K footage of the grand, much more exclusive reveals that they had closed off to the general public for us to take a look at. Some of which we have already gotten a little bit of a deep dive through Inart's website and social media handles as far as the 1/6 scale format things are concerned. Specifically, the David Corenswet James Gunn Superman figure that they have coming down the pipeline. We had one table that was a bit more emphatic on the 1/6 scale stuff, and one of which was the Superman that also comes bundled with the Crypto figure and a bonus closed eye head sculpt. Gotta be honest, in person, this thing looks much better. Even though I was already really well impressed by the photos, I actually thought to myself that Inart kind of hit it out of the park with those preliminary promo photos when the figure was first unveiled. And then seeing it in person, kind of getting it in quite literally a different light and shooting some of this footage, the suit looks a whole lot better. And I think some of the paint applications behind the face on both the regular head sculpt and the closed eyes head sculpt was really well done. I do think that maybe a little bit of better paint applications could be utilized on the Crypto, but apart from that, I'm so far really well impressed by the Inart David Corenswet Superman. Next to him was the iconic trio from Hogwarts, of course, Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, and Hermione Granger from year one, I believe. This is the Sorcerer's Stone interpretations, along with a full Hogwarts dormitory diorama, and they look great. I didn't necessarily capture so much footage because, you know, as much as I love Harry Potter, I don't love him enough to collect the figures, and plus, this is Harry Potter. They're kind of up there with Lord of the Rings, where if you collect one, you kind of need almost all of them. If you collect Harry, I need Ron and Hermione. If I get Ron, Hermione, and Ron, I need a Hagrid or a Snape to chastise them, or a Dumbledore. Same thing with Lord of the Rings. I'm not just getting Frodo, I'm getting the goddamn Fellowship. It's a slippery slope, and I'm not about to start it. Plus, it's difficult for me to be so attentive to these guys when I know that the remainder of that table, along with the secondary table, had the 1/12 scale Inart figures, of which we had a couple that we technically have seen before, but they were predominantly brand new reveals, starting with probably the biggest attention grabbers, 1/12 scale BVS, Batman, and Superman from the Zack Snyder film. They're being brought to the 1/12 scale format by Inart, and for most of you are probably already thinking these are going to be some harsh competitors to the likes of Mafex and Ace Age Figure Arts, which I think are the two biggest names in the game as far as this scale is concerned, because seeing them firsthand, I can tell you they're probably going to be scaling around the 6-inch format. So they're going to be a little dwarfed by McFarlane Toys, because that company often opts for 7-inch. And then forget about FonJoy, because FonJoy aims for, I want to say 9 inches, 9.5, depending on the scale. Some certain figures go for 10, like the Armored Batman, I think is like a full 10, because of how much of a stockier build that is. But this is definitely going to be scaling better with companies like Mafex and Figure Arts, maybe even Sentinel, depending on which property they take on. And I gotta be honest, these things look, pardon my language, awesome. They really do. As far as the sculpting, the suits have amazing texture on them. They look legitimately like the suits. As far as the paint applications look 1-to-1 accurate. The texture between the way that this kind of looks like on the Henry Cavill Superman, or the little skin graft that's happening on the surface for the Dark Knight Returns inspired BVS Batfleck suit, that looks incredible. The texture on the cowl, again, I was trying not to spend too much time in there because at one point I did feel like I was starting to hog the area around the table, trying to capture as much of this footage as possible. But at the same time, they just look that good and that attractive. I did, however, start to think in my thoughts as I was kind of looking at these figures through both my lens and through my eyes, something similar to what some other people have also brought up in the comments whenever I posted some photos on social media as well as the subreddits. Some people were able to observe that there are in fact missing joints. That's because these two guys are rather those. It's funny because they go for two styles of prototypes in art, very similar to other toy companies, where you'll have one version of a prototype where it's either unpainted, completely lacking of detail, but fully articulated, and at least the basic parts of the body are sculpted out, but well articulated. You can fully pose it, you have movable joints all across the board. Then the other option, which is what they opted to do for the BVS Superman and Batman, is to fully paint, fully sculpt, and fully detail the figures, but completely not articulate them. So they're pretty much little like T-posing statues, but they're going to be articulated after the facts. And again, Inart is not the only company that does this. You have, I think I've seen Beast Kingdom do it. I've seen Fonjoy do it, most definitely. I've seen some unpainted or fully painted prototypes of Fonjoy at certain events overseas where you have a proof of concept, but you can tell that only like the torso articulated, but then the arms are completely static like this. So a lot of companies like to do this just so, again, they can kind of pitch a proof of concept of what they got working while they iron out licensing approval, etc., all the different elements that make these things. And so that was exactly what was going on right here. I highly, highly doubt that they're actually, especially from my first-hand experience with the Christian Bale Dark Knight Rises 1/12 scale Batman figure, they're not going to be doing a full-blown, like stitched, felt good suit and then putting an articulated body underneath. That's going to, at least at this scale. Obviously, that's always the direction to do in 1/6 scale, and I know that there's been rumors aplenty, actually not even rumors, I think they are still in the process of developing it, but there was definitely no showcase of that happening here at this event. But I know that they have touched upon the concept of a 1/6 scale Ben Affleck Batman from BVS that's probably going to be approaching those practices of developing a body with articulation and then putting the suit on top of it. You can do that with a canvas of 1/6 scale. In 1/12, this figure is for sure going to be a very well done mixed media sculpt work as far as, ABS and PVC and whatnot, similar to that of the Christian Bale 1/12 Batman, but it's still going to be a body with joints bending and cutting all the way across, as long as the articulation feels really good in hand, which I personally have a pretty good amount of confidence that Inart's going to nail that, because that's how they were able to nail it with the Christian Bale Batman. I had very few, literally like one or two qualms of the articulation. Apart from that, I loved it. It felt good in hand. It didn't feel like I was going to break. It didn't feel overly rigid or overly loose. Good balance, good mobility, great posing, and if that's a boat of things to come, then I would imagine that BVS, Batman, and Superman are going to be in good hands as far as the articulation is concerned. And from what I can tell here, seeing them on the table, the sculpt work and the likenesses to both actors are pretty spot on. I would probably say that maybe a little bit of lightening on the irises of Henry Cavill's eyes to make his eyes just a little bluer and clearer and not so dark could probably use some work. But apart from that, those two things are looking immaculate, along with, of course, certain applications that felt good specifically for either of their capes, and we might be looking at some 2 solid home runs. Next to him, however, there was an unpainted but articulated Catwoman prototype from The Dark Knight Rises, the Anne Hathaway interpretation. This was a little strange because we technically have seen an articulated but then fully detailed and fully painted Catwoman at last year's Inart event, and then probably a couple of other Inart events since then that were then presented overseas in China. So I was a little puzzled, a little confused as to why there was an unpainted prototype here. I don't know if it was like a last minute addition, and from a, like I said, constructive criticism viewpoint, I probably wouldn't have included her because it kind of messes up the feng shui, if you will, of having not only her be included here, because like I said, we've seen the painted prototype, the fully detailed prototype before, but then it kind of distracts and takes away from the synchronicity of not just the BVS, Batfleck, and Superman, but also right next to them, a fully painted and articulated Robert Pattinson Batman in 1/12, which it's funny because I was surprised to see that here, and yet I shouldn't have been, considering that Inart has already done a really immaculate 1/6 scale rooted hair Pattinson Batman, of which I've already covered on the channel. If you guys haven't seen that review, go and check it out, search it up. But considering that they've already nailed it in that bigger canvas, like I mentioned before, it only makes sense that they would just take all the things that they kind of learned, both on the positive and on the negative of developing that figure, and just shrink it down. And then, of course, there's going to be some things that they can kind of bypass as far as rooted hair, of being super well done as far as the sculpting and the detail, because you are dealing with a smaller, like I said, a smaller foundation to build on some of those things, but at the same time taking what worked on the Christian Bale Batman and applying it to a Pattinson likeness. The only nitpick I have with this shrunken down Pattinson in 1/12 is that maybe the eyes could be brought forward a little bit, because it's a little, apart from the chin, it's difficult to really see too much of Pattinson's likeness, and only time will tell if either the Pattinson Batman or the BVS Batman that we saw here in 1/12 are going to have respective unmasked head sculpts that have a full-blown Ben Affleck and a full-blown Robert Pattinson likeness. I can only attest that there's probably going to be deluxe editions that are going to cost a little bit extra, but are going to come with those heads later down the line, just like Bale Batman did. But this thing looks awesome. I believe it's going to look like he's got to have a wired cape, but on top of that, the actual applications of the surface for the texture work on the cape, the weathering on the suit. The weathering on the suit is probably the biggest seller as far as the panels and all this thing right here, which, like I said, it looks like they're just mainly taking what worked for them in 1/6 and just making it in 1/12. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's probably the right way to go. And then from there, we only have 3 other iterations in 1/12, one of which, again, we've seen before, and this time kind of made a resurgence, which was the Batman Who Laughs from Dark Knight's Metal here, fully articulated, posed up, but along with that, a handful of other accessories that he's more than likely going to come included with. Next to him, however, was yet another big shocker, Exi-Suit Batman from the Arkham Origins DLC. That is a deep cut, but I guess it kind of makes sense considering their competitor, Hot Toys, has already made a 1/6 scale interpretation. So I can only imagine that maybe Inart said, well, there's some potential there. That thing actually sold a good amount. Not the greatest gangbusters, but there was some demand for it. Why not do a 1/12? And so here we have an unpainted yet articulated prototype. So a good, nice little proof of concept. It is, however, a little strange that in his stead, we still haven't seen Arkham Origins Batman. And Arkham Origins Batman has been around for quite a while, ever since last year's Inart event. So that guy should be kind of around the corner. I would suspect, and this is just a speculation, this is just a prediction or a hypothesis, whatever you want to call it, that 1/12 scale Arkham Origins Batman with the default suit, not the Exi-Suit one, is probably going to be our next big release. Either him or one of the Dark Knight's Metal, probably the Batman Who Laughs, that was also set up here, because they've been cooking on them for a while, and we've seen the painted prototypes a handful of times. Not, like I said, not only at the San Diego event last year, but a handful of other Chinese events overseas since then. So I think we're getting close to release for that guy, hopefully before year's end. But it was still curious to see that it wasn't present at this year's event. But still, to play, devil's advocate, it's cool that filling in that spot was the reveal that they're working on an Exi-Suit Batman. So that's going to be pretty curious. And staying on the Arkham Origins property, next to him, Deathstroke from Arkham Origins, which is really, really interesting because we have yet another competitor that's entering the 1/12 scale market and could be making a bit of a splash, and that's LPZZ. Not only are they working with an Arkham Knight Batman that is very, very close to release. I think it just got recently delayed only by a few weeks because they're kind of fiddling with some things before doing the mass production, mass release thing. But on top of that, their sophomore release is looking like it's going to be the Deathstroke from Arkham Knight, because, spoilers, Arkham Knight still has Deathstroke in the form of a side quest. But he does make an appearance, so it'll be interesting to see that you're going to have these two companies rivaling with their own Deathstrokes that look pretty similar to one another, but from different manufacturers, different practices. So far, from what I can tell, though, that I've only seen one in person, and that's Inart's, and it looks awesome. Great detail on the suit, really well done as far as the sculpting. Looks like it's fully decked out in the articulation. Feels like it's going to be one of those figures that's going to take advantage of all the armor to hide some of the cuts and joints of the articulation to look a bit more natural. And on top of that, I can only imagine the assortment of accessories this guy will come included. Here at the table, you only saw him with the sword, but apart from that, I can only imagine that he's going to have a bunch of other shit along with him as far as daggers, a couple of guns, a couple of things, an awful lot of arsenal to really be bundled and packaged in there to make that a really nice prospect and a nice addition to the 112 collection. And considering we had 2 iterations present here at the event from Arkham Origins, along with, again, what we're expecting later down the line, which is going to be the Arkham Origins proper suit Batman, I can only imagine what's coming down the pipeline from that property: Copperhead, Black Mask, and then more than likely a Joker, the Troy Baker incarnation from that game. I would say that there's, again, a bit of a hole in that market there that Inart could potentially fill. So I would argue that if these things manage to sell, I don't see why they wouldn't tackle those characters as well. And that was mainly it for Inart's event, which ultimately I was satisfied and definitely did pique my enthusiasm as far as these reveals that I was really not expecting. I was expecting, again, like I said, some of the figures that we saw last year as far as the Arkham Origins stuff, the Dark Knight's Metal, which did have some kind of representation here, but in forms that I wasn't expecting, whether it be with Deathstroke, the XC suit, and then moving on over to the Snyderverse with that Superman, that BVS, which I still say what you want about Ben Affleck's portrayal, but that suit, I always thought to myself, was pretty badass looking. And to see that a 1/12 scale incarnation is coming forth, that is a welcome surprise for me. Truly do appreciate that, along with incarnations of Pattinson. We already got Bale Batman, so it only stands the time that to see if we are going to be able to tackle Keaton next. We're going to be able to tackle Clooney and Kilmer to give us the full cinematic legacy in 1/12 scale format. That's possible, but at the same time, only time will tell to see if Inart can negotiate some kind of licensing deal. However, despite how enthusiastic I was, I will play devil's advocate and kind of, like I said, empathize with 1/6 scale collectors out there, because I do think that they were somewhat left in the dust from this event, because there really wasn't all that much 1/6 scale representation. Maybe it's possible that at a different event, whether it be here in the States or in China, they will then show us what they got cooking in 1/6 scale format, a proper BVS Batman, BVS Wonder Woman, and then other things that they've kind of touched upon as far as licenses when it comes to games, anime, original IP. We'll see. But the Inart momentum is definitely there. I just have my personal criticisms with this specific event, but I'm still going to be keeping tabs on anything that Inart is working right here, especially within the 1/12, because that is most definitely more emphatic on my alley than anything else. So I'm looking forward to it. That about does it for me, guys. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you guys enjoyed this little walkthrough of the exclusive San Diego event by Inart, let me know down below, along with a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video, thumbs down if you did not. And as always, take care and stay humble. Peace out.